Forensic Sanata, manipulating the madhouse. The fluorescent lights of North Bay Regional's Forensic Psychiatric Unit hummed a monotonous tune, a sound Walter had grown to both despise and depend on. He sat in the dayroom, a chessboard his battleground, his opponent a man named Arthur who believed himself to be the reincarnation of Napoleon Bonaparte. Walter wasn't particularly interested in chess. He was interested in Arthur's incessant chatter, his tendency to let slip details about the ward's routines, the nurse's habits, and the psychiatrist's veiled pronouncements. Each piece moved on the board was a probe, a subtle nudge designed to extract information, a silent transaction of delusion for data. Walter had arrived at North Bay a year ago, deemed not criminally responsible for an act he maintained he hadn't committed. The system, he quickly learned, was a labyrinth of power plays, where sanity was a currency and manipulation the key to survival. The psychiatrists, with their sterile pronouncements and detached gazes, held the keys to freedom, or at least, a marginally less restrictive form of confinement. The nurses, overworked and often indifferent, were the foot soldiers, doling out medication, enforcing rules and occasionally turning a blind eye to the ward's darker undercurrents. The patients, a motley collection of lost souls and broken minds, were both pawns and players in this intricate game. His real game, however, was not chess. It was the slow, painstaking process of documenting the unit's inner workings, the subtle abuses, the casual cruelties, and the systemic indifference. He wrote meticulously in a small, leather-bound notebook, hidden beneath his mattress, filling its pages with observations, transcripts of conversations, and meticulously detailed accounts of the ward's daily routines. He documented the over-medication of certain patients, the arbitrary punishments meted out for minor infractions, and the subtle ways in which the psychiatrists maintained their control. He discovered, for instance, that Nurse Nurse Evelyn, had a penchant for forgetting to administer medication to patients she deemed troublemakers, leading to predictable outbursts and further justifications for increased dosages. He noted that Dr. Albright, a young psychiatrist eager to prove himself, had a habit of diagnosing patients with treatment-resistant conditions after only a cursory examination, effectively condemning them to indefinite confinement. Each observation was a piece of evidence, a brick in the wall of his planned exposé. His method was subtle, patient. He cultivated friendships, offered favors, and listened intently to the complaints and grievances of his fellow inmates. He became a confidant, a shoulder to cry on, and a sounding board for their frustrations. In return, they unwittingly provided him with valuable insights, filling in the gaps in his knowledge and corroborating his suspicions. He knew he was walking a dangerous line. Discovery would mean retaliation, isolation, and perhaps a permanent consignment to the ward's most secluded corners. But the risk, he believed, was worth it. The system needed to be exposed, the abuses needed to be stopped, and he, Walter, was the one to do it. One evening, during medication call, he overheard a conversation between Dr. Albright and Nurse Evelyn. They were discussing Walter, their voices hushed but audible in the sterile air. "He's becoming a problem," Dr. Albright said, his voice tight with irritation. "He's asking too many questions, observing too closely. I don't like it." Nurse Evelyn chuckled softly. "Don't worry, doctor," she said. "I have ways of making him less inquisitive." Walter's blood ran cold. He knew in that moment that he had been marked. The game had changed, the stakes had been raised, and he was no longer just an observer but a target. He redoubled his efforts, working late into the night, scribbling furiously in his notebook, determined to finish his exposé before it was too late. He began sending letters, meticulously crafted and carefully worded, to various government officials, detailing his observations and outlining the abuses he had witnessed. He knew that his words might fall on deaf ears, that the system might be too entrenched to be changed. But he had to try. He had to fight back, to expose the truth, to reclaim his life, to show the world the madhouse within the madhouse. He mailed these letters through a sympathetic orderly, a man named David who, like Walter, harbored a deep distrust of the system. David, a quiet, unassuming man with a haunted look in his eyes, had his own reasons for wanting to see the truth exposed. However, Walter's careful game of chess was nearing its checkmate. The walls of the North Bay Regional were closing in on him, and soon the hunter would become the hunted. The game had moved from observation to participation, and Walter knew with a chilling certainty that the stakes were higher than ever before. He was about to find out just how far the psychiatrists were willing to go to protect their system, their power, and their secrets. He found out as he was approached by 4 nurses and was told that it was time for medication, when in reality they were preparing him for chemical restraints after giving him extra doses that passed his max body dose. His mind raced when he realized he had been played. Retaliation's first strike. The air in Walter's small, Spartan room felt thick, charged with an unseen menace. It wasn't just the lingering scent of disinfectant, a constant reminder of his confinement, but something more insidious, a sense of being watched, of being deliberately singled out. The smiles from the nurses had become tight, their eyes glinting with a suppressed malice that sent shivers down his spine. The subtle digs, the snide remarks about his delusions of grandeur and his overactive imagination, had begun to escalate. It started subtly. His meals were consistently cold, his laundry inexplicably lost, his access to the library mysteriously restricted. Small inconveniences, perhaps, but each one a deliberate act of harassment, a calculated attempt to erode his resolve. Nurse Tim, a hulking figure with a perpetual sneer, seemed to relish the opportunity to make Walter's life miserable. He would linger outside Walter's door, whistling softly, his eyes fixed on Walter with a predatory gaze. "Having a good day, Walter?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Remember to take your medication, it's for your own good after all." Walter tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as paranoia, but he knew better. This wasn't random. This was a concerted effort, orchestrated by the psychiatrists, carried out by their willing accomplices. He was being punished for his audacity, for daring to challenge the system, for attempting to expose their secrets. He knew he had to be careful, to tread lightly, to avoid giving them any further ammunition. He continued to write in his notebook, but he did so with increased caution, hiding it more securely, writing in a smaller, more cryptic script. He knew that if they found it, his game would be over. One afternoon, during group therapy, Dr. Albright singled him out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Walter," he said, "I've been reading your file. It seems you have some interesting ideas about this facility, about the care we provide." Walter met his gaze, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm just trying to understand the system, doctor," he said, "to make sense of my situation." Dr. Albright smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. "Understanding is important, Walter," he said, "but sometimes too much understanding can be detrimental to one's mental health." The other patients shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Walter knew what Dr. Albright was saying: keep your mouth shut or face the consequences. That night the consequences arrived. As Walter lay in bed trying to sleep, he heard a soft click from outside his door. He tensed, his heart pounding in his chest. He heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, approaching his bed. He closed his eyes, feigning sleep, as Nurse Tim loomed over him, his shadow falling across the room. "Time for your medication, Walter," he whispered, his voice low and menacing. Walter opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Nurse Tim's. He saw something in his eyes, a gleam of pure malice that sent a jolt of fear through his body. Nurse Tim held out a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "This will help you relax," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Help you forget all those troublesome thoughts." Walter knew that the injection wasn't just medication. It was a message, a warning, a threat. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly extended his arm. He knew that resisting would only make things worse. He knew that he had to play along, to bide his time, to wait for an opportunity to strike back. Nurse Tim grinned, his eyes glinting in the dim light. He plunged the syringe into Walter's arm, injecting the liquid into his bloodstream. Walter felt a burning sensation, followed by a wave of dizziness. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the effects of the drug. As the darkness closed in, he thought of his notebook, hidden beneath his mattress. He thought of the letters he had sent, the seeds of truth he had planted in the outside world. He hoped that someone, somewhere, would hear his voice, would see through the lies, would expose the corruption that festered within the walls of North Bay Regional. He drifted off to sleep, his mind filled with images of shadows and whispers, of faces distorted by malice and fear. He knew that the fight was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. He could feel the noose tightening around his neck and knew he needed to get out from under the psychiatrist's control. Chemical shackles and silent screams. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of fractured realities. Walls breathed, colors bled, and the faces of his tormentors morphed into grotesque caricatures of malice. Walter's senses, already dulled by the constant barrage of medication, were now assaulted by a chemical onslaught, a deliberate attempt to shatter his mind and silence his voice. He was adrift in a sea of hallucinations, struggling to maintain a grip on reality, to remember who he was, what he was fighting for. The injections, administered with increasing frequency and potency, had turned his body into a battleground. His muscles twitched uncontrollably, his skin crawled with phantom sensations, and his mind raced with fragmented thoughts and distorted memories. He felt like a puppet, his strings pulled by unseen forces, his movements jerky and unnatural. He tried to speak, to cry out for help, but his voice was trapped in his throat, a silent scream lost in the cacophony of his mind. The nurses, their faces masked with a cold indifference, watched him with detached amusement, as if he were nothing more than a lab rat, a subject in a cruel experiment. Nurse Tim, in particular, seemed to revel in his suffering, his eyes glinting with a sadistic pleasure. "Having fun, Walter," he'd whisper, his voice a rasp in Walter's ear. "Enjoying the ride." Days bled into nights, the boundaries between reality and hallucination blurring into a seamless, nightmarish tapestry. Walter lost track of time, his sense of self dissolving into a fragmented collection of sensations and emotions. He saw faces from his past, long-forgotten memories resurfacing with startling clarity. He saw his mother, her face etched with worry, pleading with him to be careful, to stay safe. He saw his father, his face stern and disapproving, lecturing him about responsibility and consequences. He saw his accusers, their faces twisted with hatred, their voices echoing in his mind, condemning him for crimes he didn't commit. He tried to fight back, to resist the effects of the drugs, to cling to the last vestiges of his sanity. He focused on his notebook, on the words he had written, on the truth he had uncovered. He imagined himself reading his exposé aloud, his voice clear and strong, exposing the corruption and abuse that festered within the walls of North Bay Regional. He imagined the faces of the psychiatrists, their expressions of arrogance and indifference replaced with shock and fear. He imagined the faces of the patients, their eyes lighting up with hope and gratitude. This vision, this dream of justice, was his lifeline, the only thing that kept him from succumbing to the darkness. But the drugs were relentless, their grip tightening with each passing hour. Walter felt himself slipping away, his mind dissolving into a swirling vortex of madness. He saw grotesque figures emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They whispered to him, tempting him with promises of power and control, urging him to embrace the darkness, to surrender to the chaos. He knew that they were trying to break him, to destroy his spirit, to turn him into one of them. In a desperate attempt to reclaim his sanity, Walter began to focus on the physical sensations around him. He felt the rough texture of the bedsheets against his skin, the cold metal of the bars on his window, the taste of stale medication in his mouth. He concentrated on his breathing, on the rise and fall of his chest, on the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He tried to anchor himself to the present moment, to resist the pull of the hallucinations. He succeeded momentarily. He felt a flicker of clarity, a brief respite from the madness. He saw his room, the bare walls, the simple furniture, the single window overlooking the bleak landscape. He saw himself lying in bed, his body trembling, his eyes wide with fear. He realized that he was still alive, that he was still fighting. He drew a deep breath, and with all his remaining strength, he whispered a single word: truth. The word echoed in his mind, a beacon of hope in the darkness, a reminder of his purpose, his mission, his reason for being. Walter was determined to never fall back into the grip of the nurses. The streets whisper justice. The city outside North Bay Regional existed in a different dimension, a chaotic symphony of sirens, shouts, and the ceaseless rumble of traffic. The neon glow of late-night diners cast long shadows, painting the sidewalks in hues of lurid orange and electric blue. It was in this urban tapestry that the streets operated, a network of interconnected souls bound by a shared belief in justice, operating outside the confines of law and order. Their methods were unorthodox, their morality ambiguous, but their commitment to protecting the vulnerable was unwavering. Among them was a woman known only as Raven, her face obscured by a dark hoodie, her eyes like chips of obsidian, reflecting the city's relentless energy. She moved through the crowds with an easy grace, a ghost in the machine, her senses attuned to the whispers of the city, the cries for help that often went unheard. Raven had heard about Walter, about the abuses he had suffered within the walls of North Bay Regional. She had heard about the psychiatrist's cruelty, the nurse's complicity, and the systemic indifference that allowed such horrors to persist. And she knew that something had to be done. The streets didn't operate with grand pronouncements or public demonstrations. Their interventions were subtle, targeted, and often irreversible. They believed in consequences, in making those who abused their power accountable for their actions. They had a network of informants, a web of connections that spanned the city's underbelly, providing them with information and resources. They knew where people lived, where they worked, what their weaknesses were. And they weren't afraid to use that knowledge. Raven, along with a few trusted members of the streets, began to investigate Nurse Tim. They followed him, observed his routines, documented his behavior. They learned that he lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, that he was a heavy drinker, and that he had a penchant for gambling. They also learned that he was deeply insecure, that he craved validation, and that he was easily manipulated. The plan began to take shape, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to expose Nurse Tim's cruelty and bring him to justice. They started by spreading rumors, whispers about his behavior towards Walter, about the excessive chemical restraints, about the subtle acts of torture. They planted these seeds of doubt in the minds of his colleagues, his friends, and his family. They wanted to isolate him, to make him feel vulnerable, to make him question his own actions. Next, they began to target his weaknesses. They sabotaged his gambling debts, ensuring that he lost more money than he could afford. They spread rumors about his drinking, damaging his reputation and jeopardizing his job. They wanted to make him desperate, to push him to the edge, to force him to confront the consequences of his actions. Raven knew that their methods were controversial, that some might consider them to be vigilantes, taking the law into their own hands. But she believed that sometimes the only way to fight injustice was to operate outside the system, to use whatever means necessary to protect the vulnerable. She had seen too much suffering, too much cruelty, to stand by and do nothing. The final stage of their plan involved a direct confrontation, a face-to-face encounter designed to force Nurse Tim to acknowledge his guilt and to make amends for his actions. They knew that it was a risky move, that it could have unintended consequences, but they were willing to take the risk. They believed that Walter deserved justice, and that Nurse Tim deserved to be held accountable. As Raven prepared for the confrontation, she thought of Walter, of his resilience, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to the truth. She knew that he was counting on them, that he was putting his faith in the streets to protect him, to fight for him, to bring him justice. And she was determined not to let him down. The streets would whisper his name and deliver what the hospital could not. Tim's reckoning and tranquil aftermath. The rain hammered against the grimy windows of Tim's apartment, a relentless percussion that mirrored the pounding in his chest. He hadn't slept properly in days, haunted by the whispers, the rumors, the subtle acts of sabotage that had plagued his life. His gambling debts were spiraling out of control. His drinking had become a desperate attempt to numb the gnawing anxiety, and even his colleagues seemed to be avoiding him, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He knew with a chilling certainty that something was coming, that he was being hunted. The knock on his door was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of terror through his body. He peered through the peephole, his heart leaping into his throat. Two figures stood outside, cloaked in shadows, their faces obscured by hoodies. He didn't recognize them, but he knew, instinctively, that they were the ones he had been dreading. He considered ignoring them, pretending he wasn't home, but he knew that it was futile. They would just keep knocking, keep harassing him, until he was forced to confront them. He opened the door, his hand trembling on the knob. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figures remained silent, their eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. One of them, a woman with eyes like chips of obsidian, stepped forward. "We need to talk, Tim," she said, her voice low and devoid of emotion. "About Walter." Tim's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what they wanted. He had tried to bury the memory of Walter, to convince himself that he was just following orders, that he was doing what was necessary to maintain order in the ward. But the guilt had been gnawing at him, a constant reminder of his cruelty, his complicity in the abuse. He stammered, I don't know what you're talking about." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to us, Tim," she said. "We know everything. We know about the excessive chemical restraints, the subtle acts of torture, the deliberate attempts to break him." Tim's facade crumbled. He burst into tears, his body shaking uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I didn't mean to. I was just following orders. I was afraid of the psychiatrists. They told me what to do, and I did it. I didn't know what else to do." The woman remained unmoved, her expression implacable. "That's not good enough, Tim," she said. "You had a choice. You could have refused, you could have spoken up, but you didn't. You chose to be complicit in the abuse, and now you have to face the consequences." What followed was not physical violence, but a carefully orchestrated psychological breakdown. They confronted him with the details of his actions, forcing him to relive the moments of cruelty, to confront the suffering he had inflicted. They showed him photographs, recordings, and testimonies, each one a nail in the coffin of his conscience. They stripped him bare, exposing his insecurities, his fears, and his vulnerabilities. By the time they were finished, Tim was a broken man, his spirit crushed, his mind shattered. The streets left him sobbing on the floor, a hollow shell of his former self. The trauma of the encounter, coupled with the weight of his guilt, proved too much to bear. He was placed on anti-anxiety medication, deemed unfit to work, and forced to confront the reality of his actions. The psychiatrists, realizing that they had gone too far, distanced themselves from the situation, leaving Tim to face the consequences alone. Back at North Bay Regional, a sense of unease settled over the ward. The nurses, witnessing Tim's downfall, became more cautious, more attentive to the patient's needs. The psychiatrists, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, toned down their rhetoric, mindful of the scrutiny that had been brought upon them. Walter, though still wary, noticed a subtle improvement in his treatment. The chemical restraints were less frequent, the harassment less overt, and the overall atmosphere less oppressive. He knew that the streets had delivered a message, a clear and unmistakable warning. Abuse would not be tolerated. He could not help the feeling of vindication and peace settling over him. In the city, Raven watched from the shadows, her eyes fixed on North Bay Regional. She knew that their work was far from over, that the system was still corrupt, that the fight for justice was a never-ending battle. But she also knew that they had made a difference, that they had sent a message, that they had given hope to those who had been forgotten. The streets had whispered justice, and for now, at least, the madhouse was a little less mad. Vindication under a watchful gaze. A fragile tranquility descended upon Walter's existence within the walls of North Bay Regional. The oppressive atmosphere, once thick with malice and fear, had thinned, replaced by a cautious calm. The nurses, their faces etched with a newfound respect, treated him with a semblance of professionalism, their words measured, their actions restrained. The psychiatrists, their eyes betraying a hint of apprehension, kept their distance, their pronouncements vague and noncommittal. Tim's absence hung heavy in the air, a silent reminder of the consequences of cruelty. His name was never mentioned, his memory seemingly erased from the ward's collective consciousness. But Walter knew that he had not been forgotten, that his downfall had served as a stark warning to those who would abuse their power. He saw it in the nurses' averted gazes, in the psychiatrist's hushed conversations, in the subtle shifts in the ward's power dynamics. Walter, however, remained vigilant. He knew that the system was inherently corrupt, that the potential for abuse was ever present. He continued to observe, to document, to write in his notebook, his senses attuned to any sign of a return to the old ways. He knew that the tranquility was fragile, that it could shatter at any moment, leaving him vulnerable once again. But he also knew that he was no longer alone, that he had allies, both within and outside the walls of North Bay Regional. He was no longer just a patient, a victim, but a survivor, a fighter, a symbol of hope. He found solace in the small victories, in the subtle acts of kindness that now punctuated his days. A nurse offering him an extra blanket on a cold night, a fellow patient sharing a piece of forbidden candy, an orderly engaging him in a genuine conversation. These moments, though seemingly insignificant, were testaments to the power of human connection, to the enduring capacity for empathy and compassion, even in the darkest of places. He also found solace in his writing, in the act of transforming his experiences into words, of giving voice to the voiceless. He continued to send letters, though now they were less accusatory, more reflective, exploring the complexities of the system, the motivations of the individuals within it, and the potential for change. He hoped that his words would reach those who had the power to make a difference, to reform the system, to prevent future abuses. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Walter's life settled into a routine, a monotonous rhythm of medication, therapy, and observation. But beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was brewing. The patients, inspired by Walter's courage, began to speak out, to challenge the authority of the psychiatrists, to demand better treatment. The nurses, emboldened by Tim's downfall, began to question the orders they were given, to refuse to participate in acts of cruelty. The system, slowly but surely, was beginning to change. One evening, as Walter sat in his room, writing in his notebook, he heard a soft knock on his door. He looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. It was Raven, her face obscured by her hoodie, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "We need to talk, Walter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Walter knew that her visit was not a social call, that something significant had happened. He closed his notebook, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for whatever was to come. He rose up and smiled. "Thank you, my friend." As Raven spoke, Walter understood that the fight for justice was a never-ending battle, that the forces of corruption were always lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. But he also understood that the power of the human spirit, the capacity for resilience and compassion, was stronger than any system, any institution, any force of oppression. He was released back into society with full vindication, and started his life anew with the help of the streets.